Well, thanks a lot. It's been a great sabbatical semester here, very, very short it seems like now. The last time I was on sabbatical, it started out really cold in Chicago, and I got a bunch of work done, and then it sort of opened into the spring and warmth of creativity, and here it seems like, you know, the reverse, where we've got to get all the work done at the end and walk outside. But it's always better than Bergen. It's not raining. Bergen is very pretty, by the way. I shouldn't discourage you from coming. $99 is insane if that remains, and we'll put you up and you can come over for dinner. I wanted to talk a little bit. Yeah, I think they cut it off because nobody wants to go to Bergen or Providence this time of year. I want to talk a little bit today about combinatory digital poetics. I'll try to give you a very brief background. I'm sort of adapting a talk that I did for like 2.5 hours last week in Berkeley for about 40 minutes here today, and I want to get to some of the work. Many of you, I know, will be familiar with some of these concepts, so I'll sort of rush through them, but I just wanted to mention that that combinatory work or generative work is actually the first genre of electronic literature. A lot of people who work with other forms, with kinetic poetry, with story generation, even with hypertext, integrate this as an element of their practice. Certainly, John, who's in the room, particularly much of his early work was using combinatory techniques in a very interesting way. But to come back to sort of where it comes from, originally Tristan Tzara of the Dada suggested how to become a great poet, which was to take the newspaper of the day, cut it into strips, cut out the article, put it into a bag, shake it gently, remove one cutting after the order in which they emerge, copy conscientiously, and then the poem will be like you, and you will now become an infinitely original writer with a charming sensitivity, although still misunderstood by the common people. And that sounds funny, but actually, you know, I regularly do this with students. And it's interesting when you take the news of the day and you jumble it up and you represent it to yourself in a way that the syntax has changed and so forth, you actually do end up with something that is both defamiliarizing and poetic and interesting in that sense. Of course, they were trying to contest nationalism and contest sort of the hegemony of that form of language, right? Sort of going back to the roots, to the utter basis of language. Surrealist writing games and drawing games are also sort of an example of embracing the randomness and sort of the collective unconscious that the surrealists were trying to grab onto. And again, what you end up with when you have this form of randomness or blind collaboration between people is something that none of them would have anticipated. So in this case, you know, you actually, this is a really good line right here, because you make the drawing, you leave the lines, someone comes along and takes those lines without knowing what's beneath, and then adds to it. Okay, so why would we do things like this? William S. Burroughs, who did a lot of work with cut-ups and things like Naked Lunch, and in audio work with Brian Geisen and other writing forms. He said that the photographers would tell you that often their best shots are accidents, and the writers will tell you the same, that the best reading seems to be done almost by accident, but writers, until the cut-up method was made explicit, didn't realize that all writing is in fact cut-ups. And that they didn't have a way to introduce the accident of spontaneity, that you can't will it, but you can introduce the unpredictable, spontaneous factor with a pair of scissors, and thus surprise yourself. Also very interested, and I think electronic literature in general is very interested in the idea of writing under constraints, because these constraints are sort of enforced by the fact that we're using algorithms and programs. Really, one of the things we're doing is building constraints. Anyone who's familiar with experimental writing or electronic literature will be familiar with 100,000 Billion Poems by Raymond Queneau, which was it was a sonnet. It was actually 10 sonnets printed 10 pages, which were then cut with each line being cut, so you end up with 10 to the 14th power of sonnets. Possible, a potential literature machine. And all of them work, at least in terms of rhyme scheme. So that's a sort of influence. The writer Harry Matthews, and we think again about what are the functions of constraints, and I really liked his take on it, which was that constraints are both interesting from this sort of Eulipian perspective, where you have mathematicians and writers collaborating together, but they're also productive in the sense that they free the writer to think about things and to focus on things in a way that frees their creativity. So the classic example of this would be Raymond Queneau's Avoid or Desperation, where he was writing a novel without using the letter E. But why was he writing a novel without using the letter E? He was actually writing it because the novel had a lot to do with the disappearance of his parents during the Holocaust. And he couldn't actually approach that subject in the same way if he was coming to it from a direct angle. But by using the oblique angle of the constraint and thinking about how to create this sentence without using the letter E, he was able to approach that subject and create a moving novel. So here's another classic example of a simple constraint. Snowball, a line that increases one letter at a time as it's read. This has been an important part of practices in digital media, in digital poetry, text generation. And we could argue about what's the difference between text generation and combinatory poetics. I usually choose to think in terms of the combinatory because it stretches back. And you could say that text generation is only things that create language from more, essentially, whole cloth. But there's a variety of approaches to working with this. Okay, so going back historically, maybe the first text generator by Christopher Strachey, who was rumored to be a lover of Alan Turing. It was certainly his contemporary, but if we read the output of the love letter generator, duck, duck, you are my little affection, my beautiful appetite, my eager hunger, my covetous love, lust for your infatuation. My yearning anxiously clings to your fellow feeling, yours eagerly, MUC. MUC sort of standing for Manchester University Computer. This is a very sort of simple combinatory process, but there's been some very interesting scholarship, actually. Noah Wardrop-Fruin and Jeremy Douglas have written about this, theorizing that part of what he was doing by creating this very odd-sounding, uncanny, not quite profession of love, was parroting heterosexual or heteronormative love through this program. Theo Lutz from Germany, who was, by the way, Christopher Strachey, Theo Lutz, many of the first people who did this didn't consider themselves to be poets. He was essentially a linguist, and I won't read the German to you, but let's read a little bit of this. Not every look is near, no village is late, a castle is free, and every farmer is far. Every stranger is far, a day is late, every house is dark, an eye is deep. Not every castle is old, every day is old. This seems very much like intended poetry. It reads to me as if it were a poem, and not a bad poem. Can anybody guess what the corpus, what corpus this was based on? Looks like telegrams, but the actual text. So he used titles from Kafka novels and short stories as the basis for his corpus, and I think that has some effect on the poetic nature of the text. Again, I won't read the first sort of intended, what at least most people think is kind of the first intended poetry generator by Alison Knowles and James Tunney in 1967, a collaboration that came out of Bell Labs. But the House of Dust, which again produces these pretty simple stanzas, a house of roots in Japan using electricity, inhabited by people who would eat a great deal, a house of roots among high mountains using candles, inhabited by people who sleep very little. Interesting lines, not great poetry, but the thing that I love about this particular work is that it's sort of archetypally fluxus in the sense that first they produced the poetry generator, but then they said, what else can we do with this? So they actually, at one point, they built several of these structures. They generated the poems and then built the structures. And then for some reason, they transported them from New York to Cal Arts on the back of an 18-wheeler truck. And then they used that as a site for performance events, including, this has got to be my favorite performance of electronic literature of all time, the helicopter drop, where they hired a helicopter and had about 40 reams of the poem printed out on dot matrix paper, and then they dropped it from the helicopter to distribute it to the hungry audiences below, just waiting for poetry. Okay, that was my quick little, what is this? There's a bunch of different approaches to combinatory poetics from, for instance, John Cayley's early clocks, the speaking clock, and projects like that use time as a basis for generating text, to things like Nick Montfort's 256 character Pearl poems that are, again, a form of constrained writing, but each of which work to produce texts that are interesting conceptually. Some of them are not interesting as language, but at least in concept they're interesting. All right, and I wanted to show briefly Taroko Gorge and Tokyo Garage. So let me just read a bit from Nick's poem here. Taroko Gorge, stones command the vein, ripplings rest, the crags rest, the crag tails the rocks. Progress through the encompassing cool clear. The crags pace the basin, ripplings hum, shapes roam the shape. Direct the encompassing cool. Forest paces the stones, mists range the shape. Track the straight. So when Nick posted this relatively simple poetry generator online, it's a JavaScript based poem, or poem generator. I liked it quite a bit because of this sort of juxtaposition. It's a nature poetry generator that's produced by a computer program. The code itself is in typical Nick fashion, very elegant, very compressed. It doesn't take much code to produce an almost infinitely running nature poetry generator. But I thought I could do something with it, and sort of almost as a joke, I took Nick's code and I adjusted it, and then I changed the language and the nature of the poem. I then posted it online and sent Nick a link and said, Nick, I've improved your poem. So this is Tokyo Garage. Prostitute endures the spiritual seeker, panda bears burn, bureaucrats rest, travelers regret the supermodel, revivify the silent, paranoid, all-absorbing, cheap, devout worshipers contaminate the dancers, rock stars pay, freaks fall, Godzilla transforms the cuisine, scrambled the awkwardly familiar, silent, romantic, abbreviated, addict loves the banker, bicycle messengers harass, driver deceives the mystics, signify the odoriferous, robust, all-absorbing, cheap, talk show host hassles the mystics, virtual pets evacuate, cuisines walk, Buddha covets the fruit seller, signify the infantile, scantily clad, scattered speed racers welcome the sailors, shogun warriors grok the virtual pet, watch the robust, aimless, multitudinous. Okay, so the interesting thing about this, there's a couple of interesting things. One is that I took Nick's code base and I just completely substituted the vocabulary. I took what was a very tight, constrained vocabulary and expanded it a great deal. If we look at, so if we look at the actual code, this is Nick's version, and then That's what I did to the language of the poem. But it was also this act of inversion, taking a nature poem, turning it into a machine that produced a sort of cosmopolitan nightmare version of the city, this imaginary version of Tokyo. So that was interesting, but then what happened next was even more interesting, and I think important as we think about electronic literature and its nature as a community, is that then J.R. Carpenter, some people saw this online, said, oh, that's an interesting thing to do. J.R. Carpenter took the same code base and produced Gorge, a poetry generator about eating and digestion. Talon Mehmet took the code base and produced Toy Garbage, a poetry generator about strange games and junky toys of the 1980s. Eric Snodgrass wrote a pornographic poem about the relationship between the Beatles and Yoko Ono, Yoko Engorged. And then, of course, there was Ty K. George. So the interesting thing is that this became this relatively simple gesture that was originally a joke, kind of became a, Yoko and Gorge took over, kind of became a genre on its own. And the thing that I love about this is that everyone is okay with sharing the code in that way. And Nick, in fact, sort of encourages that. And the other thing that I really love about it is when I talk to writer friends and they say, I couldn't possibly do electronic literature. I like to write. I love what you guys do. But the coding, man, I could never program a computer. Well, it's great to just open this up, show the source code, and say, well, maybe you can't program a computer, but you can tell the difference between adjectives and adverbs, right? And you can create a list of interesting nouns and verbs, can't you? And students jump in and do this. We use this as sort of a regular exercise. And actually, a lot of these people on this list, several of them, their first work of electronic literature has been a version of Taroko Gorge. And there have been many, many more since. I did want to show at least one that I sort of programmed on my own. I don't want you to think that I've been completely dependent on Nick for all my code. As a matter of fact, to inspire myself to learn to code a little bit, I wrote a poetry generator called Frequency in Ruby. And this was a kind of, I don't know what I was going through in my life at this time, but it was a sort of insane constrained writing project where I decided to take the 200 most used words in the English language and then write 2,000 lines of poetry using only those words, so sets of 10 lines beginning with each of those words. Problematic in many ways because the 200 most used words in the English language are also like the least expressive words in the English language. But I did that fairly obsessively for a while and then decided to do a poetry generator with that. And we'll see if it produces any decent poetry. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Do you want the poem to rhyme? Yes. Yes. See, everyone chooses that, and it's always such a poor choice. All right, and I'm going to warn you, these don't really scan. They just have the rhyme scheme, but all right, let's see if we. Okay. Went over it, name her after your mother. Now you can see it's just the rhyme scheme, and the rhyme scheme sucks. Letter but not an answer why. Most of the year went by. Very into her, letter from her. Some ask why, different way to try. Will you try to form an answer? What have you found? Some could not make it here. Will you tell me why? Form a new sound. Of home we ask why here? Different way to try. Okay, and we're just going to say no right off the bat. Okay, so would you like a normal poem, a haiku, a tanka, a snowball, a doubling, a foursquare? Sorry? Haiku, sure. Around the world, people have no time. Me, I am not who you think. Our work is not through. I won't leave you time to count the syllables, but I'm pretty sure it's right. Yeah. Let's say no. Normal cheese. But I know there is another place. Live like you mean it. Good day. No one would call him. Why did you take the boy? Need to live with it. Line you would live by. Hand will not be still. Which show are you in? Mean man, found with another, here and now. When will I see you again? Think on the page. Where did you think I would be? It's a normal poem, right, John? What'd you say?
When will I see you again?
Let's do a couple more here, though. Somebody. Snowball, there you go. And let's go by character, yeah? Okay. Small animal, but a mean one, or not, made up, made man. Come down, call on me, oil me down. Go show them, very into her, animal at home. There was a way, many came to try, part of his world. Does she even know? More just than good, with no word to form. Said, what do you want? Thing about your world. Only give a little back, or you could be my first, right here where it was before. Thing or two to say to you, her answer they would study. Any land other than this one, large number of men after you. Me, I will not answer your call. Does your want change to a need? Then we will have to think on it. Was a picture you could see us in. Go study and learn about the world. It could come from water or the air. Is the picture different than before? These have been found around the home. On her need, he would try his kind hand. Her man would not say what he could see. Which America do you think was your own? Then you can show me what you are made of. Was a long time back. America was different. All right, now I'll just show really quickly one more. So the interesting thing about this is I started out trying to do a sonnet generator. This is sort of I got to get a machine to write a sonnet, right? And that was pathetic, the output. But then when I looked at what else we could do, for instance, just something as simple as counting characters in a line, that ended up yielding more interesting results, including some where these weren't necessarily really forms, like two towers, for example. Produces an interesting juxtaposition of lines, and it'll produce these different tower structures, different counts of lines every time, but then you can read across and down. And they often actually make sense, and they work as poetry. Now, part of that is that they came from this common set. The lines weren't generated; the lines were there. It's the arrangement of the lines that is different every time. Okay, moving on to show at least a little bit of the combinatory film work. Rod Coover and I, and Nick Montfort as well, became interested in this idea of what happens if we take the techniques, the combinatory techniques from poetry generation, some of the thinking about structures from combinatory poetry generation, and then apply that to cinema. So we've done a few projects, and we have a few in progress right now. Let me just show you really quickly before I show it how this system works. First, the film, this is a project that creates sort of short story films, although they all sort of fit together in a way. First, you have a generated title, then you have a story part that's composed of a video clip from a set and a voice narrative from a set. That cycle repeats. There's a moral or proverb produced, a transition, and then that whole cycle repeats again. It doesn't. It never actually repeats the narrative parts for 45 minutes, so it can be experienced as a sort of short feature film. But again, this was a sort of constrained generative process. Rod sent Nick and I each a set of images and moving images. Each of us responded in different ways. I started sort of putting them into these conceptual buckets and writing short narratives in response to them. Nick responded to some of the images by creating these perverbs, which is sort of Harry Matthews' idea of what happens when we break apart two proverbs and re-yoke them together. You often get interesting kind of comic results. And then when you say, well, what can we do with all these things together? We can have something that produces stories, and then Nick's perverbs can be the moral to those stories, because as we know, every story needs a moral. So let's watch like 3 cycles of this, and I'll give you a sense of how it works or doesn't work.
The possibility of the sleeping compartment, the mysterious stranger, the casual glance of the newspaper at the passenger across, the air of mystery. Secret agents almost always ride in trains. A whiff of perfume, a pillbox hat, a rhythmic landscape, the Freudian suggestion implicit. A martini in the dining car, a chance encounter. We always somehow expected that we would have an affair on the train, though we never properly arranged it before time ran out. I suppose, he said, we could have brought some signs or something to protest this place. Truly ugly the way it belches smoke into the sky. Sort of monstrous, isn't it? It is like it is eating itself. He said something like that in Norwegian. I couldn't really tell whether or not he was joking or serious or half serious. Everyone around here seems to love nature, but they also like to go home early from work and enjoy the benefits their natural resources provide. There's an awareness of consequences, a sort of balancing act people play with the ethical parts of themselves. There are problems of translation.
The moral of the story is, if at first you don't succeed, any train will get you there.
The sump pump failed and the basement flooded. Frustrations mount as the waters rise below. Where did he leave the flashlight? The impossibility of locating the D batteries. Figuring out which circuit breaker to flip inside the poorly marked box. All the personal failures. The waiters he had not used since the trip to the boundary waters. Unreachable plumbers. Odors of dampening photo albums. What to do, what to do, what to do. The waters rising steadily. The insurance company? Where did he put the damn policy? What is inside all these swollen cardboard boxes? 2 feet deep now, and he is splashing in the dark, futilely shining a beam on the water, watching as the heads of forgotten dolls float towards him in the scattering light. They carve away the mountain. A mountain is not so much, nothing eternal. A mountain can be stripped away layer by layer. There is great pride in the operation, making short work of geological truth. No man is a mountain, but men can wear one away. We assert our significance through these acts. These miracles of capital scrape away what thousands of years have made our diggers in trucks and men in hard hats, our remakers of nature and things. Geological time is revealed and pliable. We take what is sweet for the earth. We flatten and invert. We load our dump trucks one at a time. Buckets and buckets, we carry them away. We revise habitat. We change the geometry of the earth. We make electricity of our violations. We want what we want, and we get it when we want.
The moral of the story is, where there's a will, carry a big stick.
Find the gap between the train and the platform.
Okay, so that gives you a sense of it. It's actually quite interesting to watch it for a longer time because the story elements do actually accrue without repeating. And I don't know how much we got there, but the juxtapositions of image and text sometimes seem to make clear sense, but other times what's really interesting is how we make sense of them, how we perform this act of closure anytime that we see an image and a text together, whether they're closely intended or not. And lastly, we're not going to have too much time, but I wanted to just briefly give you an impression of Toxicity, which is another project that uses a combinatory structure, although in a different way, in that in this case the voice element and the image element are yoked together. However, it's a story about climate change and flooding on the Delaware River estuary that has two layers to it. One of which is this sort of speculative, near speculative story about what happens when the East Coast keeps getting hit with hurricanes again and again and again. Not just one incident, but many in sequence. How would our society react to that? Through the voices of, I think it's 7 or 8 characters. And then the other layer was when we started working on this was right when Hurricane Sandy hit. And I remember looking at a newspaper and seeing a picture of President Obama standing in front of this devastated shoreline. And I looked at the picture and it somehow looked very familiar to me. And it turned out that he was standing on the beach 2 blocks from the house that I used to live in when I taught in New Jersey on Brigantine Island. And so I became interested in, well, how do we think about these events in the singularity of the lives that are lost? So we added another layer, which is the death stories of people who died in Hurricane Sandy. So we sort of did this research on everyone who died in the state of New Jersey during that incident, this very sort of odd genre that appears when natural incidents occur. But sort of that's in some ways the main reason for using a combinatory structure. One is that you sort of get a panorama, and you'll hear different voices reacting differently. There'll be the confusion as these events generate. But also, there's many more stories of these individual lives than we could fit into any single run of the program. This has been shown now in a wide variety of venues, most recently the Venice Biennale, and it's been shown, it works sort of best as an installation, because then you kind of come back and you see it again and again. But we'll just look at a little bit of it since we don't have time. And we did a lot of work on this here, actually.
I was proud of the way we handled the first big storms. I'd say we did pretty well. A lot of people died. A lot of people. It was a catastrophic event. But we could have had many, many more fatalities if we hadn't rehearsed and coordinated and had such a great communication system in place. Then the sequesters came. You know, we had to cut 5% in 2013. That might not sound like much. But it was $1 billion haircut. Staff, services, supplies, trailers, blankets. And then we had 4 hurricanes in a row. All the problems with the chemical plants and water treatment facilities, all the toxins that leached up into the water supply, the meltdown in New Jersey, it hit everything, flooded every part of the system. We had every agency, from the National Guard to the Army Corps of Engineers to the NRC to OSHA to the FERC, Port Authority, Homeland on down. Everybody trying to coordinate relief and reconstruction. Just as soon as we had one situation stabilized, we'd have another event. And what did Congress do? Once we'd blown past the year's budget, they called us to the carpet. Then they cut the budgets again in 15, 16, and 17. It's the death of logical thinking.
What I remember most is the birds. The fish kills, they happen every now and again. Sometimes for natural causes, and it doesn't bother you much other than the smell, the stink of rotten fish. Something leaks out or they eat some bad algae, whatever, fish die, it's part of life on the river. Sometimes you steer your way through a nasty patch of floaters, bullhead, catfish, striped bass, white perch, gizzard, shad. Kills you to see a good eating fish oiled up like that. But the birds, the Canadian geese flying over this time of year, the feathers soak up the oil, and they look pathetic in the water. The geese and the ducks flapping around like that. The ones that make it to the shore try to run around and shake it off, but they're like half blind. They try to clean themselves and they end up eating that sludge. It's really pitiful. They try to fly and they can't anymore. Thousands of them. And Philadelphia International is right there, So it was kind of ironic watching it. The planes kept taking off and landing, but the birds couldn't get off the ground.
I remember when it all began, at least when it really started to get worse. I was just a kid when the big floods started. There had always been flooding, of course, the big ones that take out roads and rewrite shorelines. When the real storms started coming, all of them hurricanes, one after the other, all these places that had never flooded before were getting hit. I used to spend a lot of time down in the basement. Money was tight in the recession, and sometimes Mom and Dad would argue, and it seemed like a safe place. I remember one night I was down there painting things, scenes of things like I sometimes did, listening to the rain, and the walls cracked. The foundation fractured and the water seeped through. The water had a strange smell to it. It got worse and worse over time. There was a lot of mopping. Finally, the walls and floors came off kilter, and tiles and things came off, floorboards coming off and stuff. By the time the inspector said we had to move, the house itself was at a strange angle, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa or something.
The purpose of government is to protect our borders and to tackle the rat problem. The rats are taking over. We need men in trucks with traps and poison. We need to keep the electricity flowing, the water coming clean from the tap, and we need to keep the rats down. We don't need government holding our hands or telling us not to eat this or drink that. We don't need them taxing us to feed people who can't feed themselves or protect their own homes or pay their own damn doctors. The purpose of government is to make free enterprise possible, not to make life easier for every loser who walks in the door looking for a handout. If you want a handout, go to church and ask for one. I give to my church, and we give handouts all the time to people who need it. From my government, I just want good rat control and the best damn military protection money can buy.
The Quarantine Act was controversial, for sure, but the fact is, it was already one of the most toxic areas of the country. New Jersey, 5th in the nation for mesothelioma. Asbestos was used heavily in the shipyards, in the factories, built into the buildings. Barrels of formaldehyde, pools of hexavalent chromium, arsenic, benzene. So much material was buried in this region, you couldn't put a shovel in the ground without hitting something. And after the hurricanes, those chemicals leached out all over the place. Superfund was just a band-aid on a bigger problem. The meltdown at Salem, the leak at Hope Creek, they were just the last straws on the camel's back. We've had to make choices. As a country, we've had to make choices. Not every site can be remediated. It got to that point. It was an awful decision they had to make to seal off the whole region. At a certain point, you just need to give up on recovery and bury the problem. Put certain places behind fences, pour cement over them, and never let anyone live there again. Declare a total loss. Draw a new map.
George was an unsuccessful painter and sculptor born in Hungary during the middle of the last century. And his brother remembers that the Danube flooded over its banks each spring near where they lived, and that both boys were terrified by the power of the water. He couldn't understand why George nevertheless chose to live in a little bungalow that sits alongside the lagoon in Brick Township. George didn't drive and he rarely left home. Neighbors said he lived like a hermit. During the storm surge, the floodwaters washed through the bungalow and George drowned.
The Pentagon.
Okay, so that gives you a sense of the piece. It runs, again, because it's a database film, and it's one that we wrote and edited and rewrote over time. We're able to bring in new elements and cut out elements if an actor's voice was particularly grating. There's only one really grating voice left in there. And also to think about the structure and present it differently in different contexts. So sometimes we did versions that would cycle through one character at a time. Sometimes we did versions that would run on a half-hour cycle or 20-minute cycle, or the one that we use mostly now is a sort of a 45-minute cycle. There's about an hour and a half of content in the film altogether, but that's the sort of number we've kind of arrived at. And that's quite interesting to be able to take the same body of work and adjust these algorithms, simple algorithms, not I coded these things, and anyone who knows me knows that still not a great coder. But you can do a lot with just JavaScript in a web browser. I'll just briefly mention the projects that were, once I'm done with the book that I'm trying to furiously finish in the library here, that we're working on. Let's see. Yeah, so Circe, which there is a short sort of sample version that I could maybe show after questions or something. But we're trying out different things with the combinatory structure. In this case, it's a narrative film, just about feature length, and we're going to be using the combinatory elements for dialogues, which will be different each time it runs, as well as for different monologues. The theme of this work is mass extinction, because we always choose, something funny, But and again, you're going to be hearing the stories of different species every time, of different takes, and it's a narrative that's mainly between a drone pilot and a bird expert, and also layered with a story of relationship between Odysseus and Circe. So that's a project that we have a short version of, although we were working with live actors rather than voiceover actors this time, which with a very low budget poses some difficulties in that we shot this in 1 week in Ireland. So what we had is sort of what we had. We might do something different with it, or use the short version to try to get budget for a real full-length feature film. And the other project that we're working on that's shot in Greece, and this should actually be hopefully ready in the spring, early in the spring. So this is actually really bouncing off of Quinnell, but it's a sonnet generator where the sonnet will work. It's rather than sets of 10, it's sets of 5 that will alternate, but it will produce sonnets that work every time, but there'll also be clips that sort of similar to Three Rails Live, are thematically related but structured differently each time. And this time we're also working with a composer, a Chilean composer, who's Alejandro Albornoz, who's doing a composition that also will work algorithmically. So that should be an interesting project that we're looking forward to. And we have just about 5 minutes for questions, and hopefully people will stay longer and enjoy enjoy the fruits of brown catering. So I still, when I came here with The Unknown in 1999, we sort of wrote up a bunch of notes about our first experience of the electronic literature scene and of Brown. And I can tell you, the Brown catering figured into our estimation of Brown very highly. It's not everywhere. At Bergen, you cannot get pineapple-infused water at this type of event.
So, first of all, let's thank Scott.
Yeah, I could do that if you. Maybe people get snacks, and I can just put on. I can just put on Circe. And
I know that some people have to go right at one. I don't want to have.
Yeah, exactly.
The death by trickle. Before we ask Scott questions, I'd like to announce there are 2 more talks before the Christmas break, the holiday break. Wednesday the 29th at 4 p.m. here, Joe Rettberg, yet another opportunistic success for us, will be speaking on selfies and other cool social media things that she works on, and every time she's spoken on that kind of topic, everybody just, the room is mobbed and everybody doesn't want to leave. So do come back. And then on the 7th, I think, I send these out. Those of you who are not on my list can come and find me later. We'll have Sydney Skybetter, Patrick, where are you? On choreography and dance and movement.
Technology something, and technology.
Yeah, anthologies of
yes.
movement. Anyway, so that'll be very cool. So that's at noon here on the 7th. So come back. We'll have I assume we'll have the water, maybe not every time. So, questions for Scott? What is wild?
Cookies.
I was thinking about this when looking at 3 Rails, in developing the systems for sort of semi-randomly or restricted randomly generating the materials. Dealing with navigating text in that way seems to be very different than dealing with either still or moving images in that way. And I just was wondering, A, if you agree with that premise, but then B, how do you navigate those 2 things? Because they seem to be going on simultaneously. And to me, anyway, it seemed to require sort of different kinds of skills for just parsing those 2 kinds of information.
For the reader or for the?
For me, for the reader, but also for you, and putting it together and thinking about how to.
Yeah, well, that piece changed a lot, and I liked it a lot better once we sort of cycled, once we eliminated repetition. So I think that what happens is for the reader viewer is at first there is this sort of estrangement from the experience, and then as it goes on, there's 2 things that happen. One is that it becomes a bit easier for you to make these little creative leaps about how these images and text are fitting together in your mind. And the other is that because they're from a common set that aren't sort of tagged or keyworded together or anything, but you'll begin to see an image that reminds you of something you just heard 2 tracks ago, right? Because the texts are in response to each other. So it creates a kind of a unity over time with the experience. But yeah, that was really our sort of first leaping in kind of complete experiment with it. And the thing I like about it is that I show Toxicity all the time, and I always walk away. If we show the whole thing, I just feel depressed. But this actually it does surprise me still every time that I watch it. And sometimes the juxtapositions are these things that nobody would have thought of, but that are nonetheless really, really interesting. So I don't know if that answers the question. But the other aspect of that is text and image, I guess, and it helps a lot to have 2 of us. Rod is always, sort of the image creator, and I'm working with the text. And it's really these 2 projects in particular, and Hearts and Minds, evolved over a fairly long period of time. So there's been a lot of negotiation and back and forth and thinking through how narrative and image and fractured narrative and image and even poetry can fit together. Because the interesting thing about the structure of these is really, if you sort of look at those flowcharts, they're more like a formal poem than they are like anything else, actually. They sort of go back to things like a sonnet or something like that in an interesting way.
A lot of the, what I'm thinking of Merce Cunningham and John Cage, and Merce would separately choreograph a piece, and John Cage would write music, and then they would bring them together. And it's really interesting. It's similar in technique.
Yeah, very, 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 very similar process, I'd say.
So following on from Ed's question, I guess in what you showed, the morals and the preverbs are the place where you have like the voice and a cut up, where if that was pure text, you wouldn't know exactly where the join was. And with voice, you can hear it, although they still work. And they partly work because we both know both sides of what's going to happen. But have you done other things where you're using voice rather than text in combination, where you can hear the cuts?
Well, you'll definitely be able to with Circe, because some of the, if it's made as it was conceptualized, because actually the dialogue, I mean, hopefully it'll sort of be fluid and actually work as dialogue, but yeah, if that's what you're sort of asking about.
There might be different voices, though.
Oh, within a single voice. I tried to do the 100 Babies poetry generator, not the 100 Babies story generator, which was a children's work where I actually did that. I recorded one word at a time, and then it sort of produces these stories of the 100 babies. It was an unfinished project with Jessie, with my daughter, but hopefully we'll show that someday, and that does exactly that. Although, yeah, it has problems.
A lot of fathers will appreciate that, so you always have a new story to tell.
Yes.
Exactly, yeah. I do have one that does it with text. So never quite becomes a story, but it's always a chaotic situation.
Forgive me if this is a electronic literature 101 question, but I was wondering about the, you talked about the process, so we have a sense of the process. I'm wondering when you present it as more of a traditional, recitation or presentation, whether you let the audience know the process, and whether that's important for people to know, or whether you want to work to stand on its own, or...
Yeah, you want the work to stand on its own, I think, and it's in some ways it's more interesting to to show the work and then to not show here's my flow chart first, right? And certainly when we exhibit stuff, and these pieces have been exciting because we've actually gotten the work's been more and more in museum and gallery contexts, and in that case you just show the work. And people come away with what they come away with. We do, it's clear that it's combinatory in any case. But yeah, I hope that it stands on its own.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This is very exciting. It's even hard to formulate one question because there's so many applications that I see for creative writing, but also for analysis. And I'll go back to the frequency poetry generator. I work with the archive of Fernando Pessoa, the Portuguese poet that created all these heteronyms, right? And it's particularly hard to differentiate their writing styles in the vocabulary level. And I think the frequency poetry generator that you have could be very interesting to differentiate the corpus of each of his fictional writers. And they wrote a lot of sonnets.
You mean Pessoa? Yeah.
So it would be interesting to put different textual databases of the different heteronyms and to see what kinds of sonnets they generated. And a lot of his characters generated sonnets. So I'm interested in using even the frequency poetry generator as a tool for analysis.
Yeah, well, I could show you the code, and then you might change your mind. It is the worst. I mean, it's marked up very nicely. It's sort of like you can read it like a document, but it's in terms of its applicability to other things. Some things are very simple. Counting letters is simple, but actually, for example, the rhyme stuff was all done by hand in arrays. And syllable counts were hand in arrays. So you could do that same thing, but one thing you should be aware of though is do you know Rui Torres and Manuel Portela?
Yes.
Okay, good, yeah, because they've done, so I know they're doing something with Pessoa.
Yeah, they just published the Book of the Squire online, the website, it's beautiful.
Yeah, and they've done wonderful things with sort of remediating early combinatory poetry, remediating concrete poetry as kinetic poetry. The Poetics Project's an amazing piece of work. Yeah.
I like your idea of, it's almost like like 1,000 monkeys and the typewriters. It's as if you want to set up the constraints and see if somebody can make Pessoa.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Pessoa made so many Pessoas, so that, Do you know Antonio Machado's, Antonio Machado invented also a poet, and this poet that he invented a machine of making poetry.
Oh, okay.
In his literature, you would like that too.
Yeah. Calvino did the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So I see the triple beginning. So again, let's thank Scott. You can then play things, and everybody can eat the cookies and listen to the new piece and ask Scott more questions. So thank you again.
Okay. All right, I'll put it on if you want. Yeah, sure. You haven't seen it yet. He's seen it. It made John cry. Yeah. It didn't really make him cry. I've been trying to do that my whole life, but it's a lot of. Didn't you see it? And oh, you skipped it? Okay. Maybe it was just some other old guy crying. Sorry, that was. You saw it. You'll see. So this is just a study. It's actually not combinatory yet. It was a beautiful place.
I'm the last of my kind. Ages ago there was an island that floated over oceans, moving to and fro in the storm. A boatman lost in thought came across it. He stepped onto the shore, gathered some driftwood and lit a fire to warm himself. As soon as the island was touched by fire, it became fixed in place. As the fog lifted, the boatman discovered he was on the bank between the sea and the lake. He saw an old woman leading a great white cow before her. When she struck the cow with the stick,
that's what I was saying. This one is
when the boatman ran to the old woman and confronted her, striking her boldly, both he and she were transformed into stone. Sometimes the cow returns, to foretell times of darkness and death. This island is where I made my home. I live here alone, the last of my kind. Here I greet creatures who appear in the mist, the last of their kind. They come here to live out their final lives on this island. I live alone, gathering my roots and waiting for the boatman's return.
A mandatory vacation is part of the standard routine when you involve in an incident with collapse. It both serves to give the higher-ups time to do reports and evaluations, and it gives the operators time to clear their heads. Just drive over to Vegas and check into a hotel, so that you like feeling the chill.
Look at you.
And so in this case, there were several children in the house at the time when the son spoke. At the time, I fired forces. At the time, I was ordered to launch the missile. And that was not the intelligence. It was contrary to the intelligence. It's something we try to avoid, children in particular. That rattles the local population, turns people against us, creates a problem to a generator of ignorance. This is not the only time this has happened, but it's the only time this has happened to me. And the target.
One of his characters is let's say
Again, you know, I guess it is normal that they try to use children.
Well, this is actually,
We saw him go in.
so this is the last one.
But we didn't know who else was there. I would have requested a change in the order if I had known.
But the story centers around this sort of kind of a retelling of the Circe story, but also this dialogue between an ornithologist and a drone pilot who are dealing with crises. Yeah, I really hope that
Came back here because this place is like.
So the dialogues are there, is people want to hear their voices. Was that generally produced as well? Or?
No, there'd be some scenes will have these one lines, others will be fixed. And then there's monologues at various points, which we've got a couple of them out of so I mean, it doesn't necessarily have consequential change on the outcome of the story, but it sort of provides different takes and sort of different types.
And is this one you use music for?
No, the music one's in the song.
I mean, actually, so surprised.
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to, I hope this one gets made. Because we shot the whole thing.
Yeah.
But there was one actress who
yeah.
The Circe actress was great. And then it sort of so. But it's it's enough to probably.
Maybe nature doesn't care at all.
But the sonnet thing will work, and he'll have to keep all the text in because of constraints.
Right. There you go.
That's always cut my text.
Yeah.
For me, watching movies is such a sport. It's like a kind of therapy.
It's something like poetry generators as well.
For me, that's
Yeah, the rooms are that if you go
I find great operations extremely nice. The optic travel such immense distances. They face so many challenges.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, most of the time.
Pretty good.
So I feel very much.
Oh, yeah.
When I was very emotional, so
When I was in Berkeley, car got robbed.
recently, of course, most of the dinosaurs was related to
it was.
many handfuls, similar skeletal structures. We imagine a kind of apocalyptic shock, endpoint version of life and dying off. And there's evidence that most of them did perish in these massive swinging species. The small theropod dinosaurs, bats of iron mind, those are immensely intelligent. Dinosaurs never die.
And then it rained. No, I didn't. No, I had to reach into the car. Basically, University of Bergen
She was worried about how I would get on about it. We had our time with last things. Last weekend trip to the islands. Last time. Last recreation. There is time. Times we experience. Days we the time it takes to light and smoke the cigarette. The time it takes to bury the dead. But there are other scales we can't process. The lifetime of a star, the movement of a continental shelf. Dying.
Use it here. Huh? In my office? Yeah, I put it on the table, but I lose my table. It's true.
So, I mean, if it's all just possible, maybe it's not place.
I remember losing something.
Yeah.
I was at sea.
Let me see what I can
remember.
What I can do.
I remember I was leading them somewhere.
Oh, yeah, no, I thought what it was going.
I remember that we had a mission. I was once a
Well, I know what it is. I know what they are. They're panels. So imagine 4 legs, panels run around these. It looks more like a walk.
Strange prophets. I remember I had someone.
Right. I think for Bruce, the poor guy who started the big thing. I was talking to maybe.
Birdwatcher recognized me from the news. He didn't want to tell me, but I got it over because he got missing from Dublin and he was mysterious. I missed my day in court to see the trial for fraud. I stand accused of taking certain farmers into certain types of investments in certain types of funds. Circe's husband, a milk man, he couldn't take his farm. He died by the old man. And Circe needed someone to run her. She became obsessed with me. She drove me, flew me off my yacht. She was so far gone. She decided she was, and she got now, we both can try. Her for kidnapping, and me for these simple accounting mistakes and misunderstandings. Otherwise, I don't start to take it off the way my marriage. I have no idea what to do with her. Maybe she'll get the help she needs.
Seems like their last decade.
What's done is done. What's dead is dead and gone.
They come from time to time, lost things in search of a home. Men, beasts, and things that wash ashore. I told him not to run to the lost visitors, but it might be dangerous. It could have been. When people come to my island, they do not stay the same. We all have beasts inside us. When I cast the spell, I guide you towards transformation, but I cannot say what you will become. Pig or boar, house cat or leopard, inchworm or bear. But once I set my eyes upon those orphans, they do not stay the same. He ran towards them, and I raised my staff. With a flash and a crack in the sky, my boy and fire appeared in the mist. They stood for a moment, one contemplating the other. The falcon craned her neck, and eyed the lesser bird as he was on a mournful cry. For a moment I thought she might devour him. We looked at each other in silence. We took our cheeks and shared our story. Then she flew into the field, and he took her. Eddie stood and stared for a moment. Then he turned back towards me and he murmured,
He understood that it was all as I had told him. He will stay with me here on this island, where last things come to gather and rest, to wait out their days until their time comes, until they must make their final journey to the kingdom of the dead.
Yeah. Yeah, it's Martin Luther King. No, it's